Welcome to channel. Today, we explore story filled with unexpected twists. Please, subscribe and like to stay updated. Let's begin. Hotel room, $120. Room service, $160. Your credit card company calling to tell you your fiancé is with another man priceless. At least I didn't marry her. I heard that consolation a lot over the next few years, but it offered me no comfort. We hadn't exchanged vows yet, but in my heart, I was already committed to her. The breakup felt just as painful as a real divorce would have, but let me start this story from the beginning. It was the late 1990s, and I had just returned to civilization after nearly 2 years in South. I was stationed at Hamilton AFB in Ridgefield, Utah, not far from my home. I was young, ready for life, and looking forward to finishing my last military deployment with as little fuss as possible. I loved my work as an Air Force policeman, but I had greater aspirations for a lengthy, successful post-USAF career, one that did not require serving in the military indefinitely. As a child, I had always wanted to be a policeman, but by the time I graduated from high school and was ready to apply to the local police academy, I recognized my prospects of success were minimal. The current mayor was lowering the city's budget, focusing on the fire, police, and other service agencies. He reduced the number of new cadet classes dramatically. They now demand candidates to have at least 2 years of college and other law enforcement experience before they are evaluated. Needless to say, they were not employing 18-year-olds who had just graduated from high school. Fast forward a few years, and the city saw a significant increase in crime, as well as some of the nation's worst fire and EMS response times. The budget difficulties were never addressed. Whatever savings there were used on other dubious enterprises. As a consequence, municipal services have become a national joke. I heard that new mayors were still working to clean up the mess left behind, but that's another tale. I needed both college and practical experience. I had no success with the local sheriff's department either, so I did the next best thing. I joined the Air Force and was authorized for my first option, military law enforcement. This surely beat the option of SP security police, which normally included standing watch duty on an aircraft hangar runway or a bomb storage bunker in the rain or snow. The work wasn't too awful, but it's never enjoyable to be a junior enlisted member in any area. There always appeared to be an urgent situation that required us to work 12-hour shifts without a day off for a week or two. So I didn't get much playtime or see much of South Korea away from base. I had a very understanding NCOIC, top enlisted supervisor of my section, who was highly pro-education and incredibly supportive of young airmen who preferred attending night college courses to drinking beer every night at the Airman's Club. He made it plain to my boss that I could always take a few hours off to attend my lessons, even if we were in the midst of a base alert or working a long shift. When I returned to the States for my second job, I discovered that things had changed somewhat. Hamilton AFB was one of our larger facilities at the time, but my unit was stationed in a remote annex on Eagle Hill, in the middle of nowhere. Shuttle buses to the main section of the base operated sporadically and seldom, and for all practical purposes, even if you had a vehicle, you were very much stuck there. Even the local community college's closest branch was inconveniently located. Worse, my new job schedule switched duty shifts every month, making attending educational courses almost impossible. The new work wasn't horrible, but it wasn't as much fun as my previous base. I was accustomed to having tasks cycled so that everyone got to handle a little bit of everything, including disturbance calls to base housing or dormitories, traffic control, administration, and base operations. However, on Eagle Hill, everything was completely routine. Every day, I'd sit at a desk and verify security badges as they entered and exited our main building, as well as deal with the piles of paperwork that came and went. Boring was a huge understatement. Even our enlisted dorm was generally very quiet, with nothing really intriguing happening. Logan, my roommate, went partying every weekend, but since his preferences were country and western and mine were 80s Brit progressive, I didn't always accompany him. The monotony of either working or being in my dorm room eventually changed my mind, and one late Saturday evening, I went partying with Logan and met Danielle. As the Beatles sang, and then I saw her standing there. She was approximately my age, standing in a corner of the club with a girlfriend, nursing a drink. She felt out of place and wasn't very into the music. Another person had asked her to dance earlier, and she had agreed, but she had no idea how the dance steps worked and had to improvise terribly. He spent the remaining dances with her partner, who seemed more tired and restless. She wasn't a traditional beauty, but there was something about her that set her apart from the other, better-dressed, and dolled-up ladies in the club. She resembled someone's lost young sister, the typical girl next door who had taken a wrong turn and ended up terribly lost in some weird and not quite pleasant new world. Her hair was long and in my preferred auburn chestnut hue, yet it seemed lifeless, as did her cheekbones. She was wearing very little, if any, makeup, and her complexion seemed sallow and blotchy, as if she hadn't been feeling well recently. She was fairly tall and skinny, yet she looked to slouch her shoulders down somewhat, as if she was attempting to become less conspicuous, to blend better into the woodwork. Despite the numerous apparent flaws, she had something. As her partner was now busy dancing on the dance floor, I decided to at least speak with her. "Hi. Since neither of us appears likely to be dancing anytime soon, I decided I may as well attempt to assist you hold up this section of the wall." It wasn't very funny or smart, but it was vaguely unusual and had the apparent benefit of sincerity. She flashed me a feeble grin, but did not attempt to flee. We spoke for a while about what music we liked, definitely not what the C&W Club was playing, and shared our favorite bands. She enjoyed heavy metal music, particularly Metallica and Slayer, but had never heard of my favorites, Genesis, Pink Floyd, Yes, or the Grateful Dead. We compromised on our only overlapping band, Led Zeppelin. An hour later, we were enjoying a late supper, early breakfast at a neighboring restaurant, where we spoke about our lives until around 3 a.m. over countless orders of English muffins, which she ate as if she hadn't eaten for days. Actually, she hadn't. She was living with some friends and sharing an apartment, and none of them had much money to spend on food recently. She worked part-time as a hostess at a nearby restaurant, but the pay was pitiful, and she received no tip credit. I saw her again the following Friday night, and we had planned to go out to a fine restaurant for dinner and then attend a movie, but we became so sidetracked when briefly visiting my dorm room that we never got out of bed until after 10 p.m. Sleepovers in the dorms by members of the opposite sex were strictly prohibited, and despite the minimal chances of being detected, many males habitually did it. I wasn't feeling very fortunate at the time, so we reluctantly dressed and went out for another late-night supper at the restaurant. The sex had been quite nice. We weren't virgins, but we'd been out of the loop for quite some time. It had simply felt unique between us, and the longer we spent together, the more difficult it got to say goodbye. We began phoning each other nightly and even managed a few quickies throughout the week until my work schedule changed monthly and I transitioned from day shift to swings. Being on swings truly improved our love lives. She'd get off work about 10 p.m. They take the bus to our favorite cafe and wait for me to get off work, arriving about 12:15 a.m. I'd have a little to eat, then we'd drive to her apartment, make love, and I'd bed there most nights, only returning to my dorm room to wash, shave, and put on a new uniform before heading to work at 3 p.m. the following day. After approximately 3 weeks of this pattern, I decided I wanted to marry her, and although she was hesitant when I asked, she did not say no. I pushed for a brief engagement and a speedy wedding, but she dragged her feet and offered countless small reasons why we shouldn't hurry. Her normal backup argument was that things had been difficult for her recently, and she was still trying to get her mind back on track. I should have noticed this as a warning and backed off, slowing things down until she felt more at ease. She had an anxious personality and could quickly get distracted, irritated, or agitated by slight provocation. Her mood started to fluctuate wildly in enormous up and down cycles, which should have given me further warning signs. She also started to oscillate between being too affectionate and clinging, which I confess I like at times, and being quite standoffish, even opposed to having kissed or touched at all. At times, she would be so nervous that she couldn't sit down. She spoke so rapidly that I couldn't comprehend a word she said. During this time, she would spend 2 to 3 days without stopping or sleeping. That should have been another warning of a different kind. I confess I knew very little about women and couldn't figure out why she was now behaving strangely. In the end, I simply chalked it up to engagement anxieties and decided, belatedly, to give her a little more space, cooling things down enough so she didn't have a total collapse before the wedding. However, the ultimate date was still being debated. I was on my last day of swing shift when I received a weird and tragic phone call at work about 6:25 p.m. from my credit union. One of the few perks of working up on Eagle Hill was that there was a branch of the local military credit union 2 buildings down from my dorm building that handled all of my military pay via direct deposit. Made low-cost car and house loans for military personnel much better than the national chain banks, and even gave us an ultra-low-interest Visa card. Since I was now back in the United States and wanted something for emergency purposes alone, I signed up for one at the same time I set up my other accounts. As a security precaution, I clicked the box indicating that this would be an infrequent use card and granted them the right to examine any and all transactions done with the card. I provided them with my duty phone and dorm room phone numbers for fast contact. In the days before electronic verification, when most locations took a carbon imprint of your card, stolen credit card numbers were common, and they still are. At least once a week while in South Korea, I had to submit a stolen credit card report for other service members who had been victimized, and I was adamant that it would not happen to me. But, evidently, it did. The customer support representative asked whether I had just booked into the Sierra Vista Hotel in Ridgefield, just off of Interstate 21. Definitely not. I opened my wallet and saw that my Visa card was missing. Also, the approximately $200 I believed I had in my wallet was gone. The customer care worker had no other records of its recent usage, but most locations did not call or have electronic ways of card verification, so it was possible that my card had previously been used in other places around town. I requested a callback number from her and obtained a fraud case number before hanging up to report the issue to Ridgefield Police. My immediate supervisor, a very incompetent second lieutenant, aren't they all? Refused to excuse me from the rest of my shift, but he couldn't stop me from phoning our company's first sergeant and convincing our CO to overrule him. 15 minutes later, I was on my way to the Sierra Vista Hotel for supper, where the desk receptionist verified that I had checked in approximately an hour earlier. More precisely, a young couple checked in about an hour ago under my identity and using my credit card. After I confirmed who I was and said that my card had been taken and used illegally, the clerk contacted the nighttime manager, who was very helpful, and requested that the Ridgefield Police Department assign several police to apprehend the criminals. The responding officer, a middle-aged Hispanic female, recorded all of my information. It helped that I was a law enforcement officer still in uniform. After retrieving another key to my room, we walked up, and I opened the door for her. The pair we had hoped to see was not immediately visible. They were bathing together in the bathroom at the time, but they had clearly been quite active. At least 6 department store shopping bags were on the floor, and a huge bag from a local liquor store chain was clearly visible on the table. Narcotics and narcotic smoking paraphernalia were found on the dresser in the room, or so I assumed. The department store purchases could probably all be returned, so the financial consequences didn't seem to be too severe. The hardest aspect was discovering who the perpetrators were, Danielle and my roommate Logan. I acknowledged that my life was rescued by a remarkable accident. I had mysteriously left my .28 service revolver on my desk back at work. Technically, it was a requirement of my uniform that I wear it at all times, and I could not recall ever taking it out of my holster and leaving it anywhere, much alone on a desk. This was an unspeakably rookie error that no junior law enforcement officer would have ever committed. However, today it saved their lives. I swear, the moment I saw them emerge naked from the shower to investigate the commotion, my hand went to my empty holster. I have no doubt that I would have discharged my firearm and murdered both of them on the spot. I realized right then what mad desires compel spouses to shoot their wives or lovers when caught off guard. Danielle and Logan would have surely died if I hadn't left my pistol, and instead, I'd be in handcuffs and facing murder charges. Neither of them was glad to see me, and they were much less happy to be led away in handcuffs in the back of a squad vehicle. Seeing Daniela's expression of extreme embarrassment and hearing her weep all the way simply devastated my soul even more. The arresting officer seemed to believe that I was in no mental state to deal with the problem further and basically ordered me back to base to do whatever reporting I needed to do there while the Ridgefield Police Department handled the rest. With nothing else to do, I returned to work for the rest of my shift. I filed a theft complaint for the stolen credit card at the base's main law enforcement office and parked myself in a chair in front of my first sergeant's office at 7:59 a.m. the following day. I gave him a thorough and unvarnished version of the facts. He gritted his teeth but found nothing wrong with my conduct, even leaving a handgun unattended, albeit in a safe place. He freed me from all chores for the following 3 days so that I could go to the clinic do a drug test, and sleep. Logan was freed from the Benton County Jail after approximately 2 days, but I never saw him again. He faced a slew of UCMJ allegations, including cocaine and amphetamine usage and distribution. OSI, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, tore up our dorm room and discovered more drugs in his locker and automobile. He prudently pleaded out on the judge's compassion and received a significantly reduced term in a federal holding facility that was not called Leavenworth. He also received a dishonorable discharge, loss of all stripes, and payment, all of the standard punishments. I subsequently learned that he successfully petitioned to be permitted to continue in the military, and he restarted his career as an E1, finally working in the social activities group educating about drugs and alcohol misuse. I spent significantly more time dealing with OSI in the next 6 months than I would have preferred. They tended to think that every airman was guilty unless proved innocent. I must have spent more than 100 hours being questioned and signing statements there, but I was finally exonerated of any role in Logan's drug activity. My service record remained spotless, but it was a paltry silver lining compared to the storm cloud of my separation with Danielle. Danielle faced only civilian charges, most of which were misdemeanors for theft and fraud, but she quickly found herself in far deeper problems for cocaine and methamphetamine possession. I also discovered that she was already wanted for felony check fraud in another jurisdiction. In reality, the ADA handling her case informed me at our first meeting that Danielle had been in continual legal problems for at least the previous 5 years since becoming a legal adult. She had previously stolen money from her family, but the accusations were dismissed soon after. There was also a sealed juvenile record for her, which neither the ADA nor I had access to. But the conclusion was clear. Danielle was a pretty screwed-up young girl with a lengthy history of drug usage. Apparently, she had attempted to go clean since I met her, but the pressure to use had been too much for her. I declined to pay her bail because the ADA advised me that spending more time in county jail before the trial hearing would be the best thing for her right now if she really wanted to go off drugs. I didn't completely agree with her argument, but she did seem to have Danielle's best interests at heart and wasn't simply looking for a quick conviction. Danielle remained in prison, and I attempted to go on with my life. When all of the expenses were added up, Danielle and Logan had spent more than $1,600 on their narcotic-induced wild shopping spree. But I was able to get most of the department store items returned and my Visa account fully credited, with the exception of the $56 they spent at the liquor store, the $90 for the hotel room, and the $150 room service charge for a champagne dinner. In my perspective, the hotel had done everything properly and by the book, including taking the time to check my card. Therefore, I didn't think it was fair to punish them for being honest, and I paid the bills myself. At this time, losing only a little more than $500 in total, including the $200 in cash, was a miracle I would gladly take. Danielle pleaded guilty on all charges but requested that I see her before her sentence. I declined. I was feverishly trying to remove her from my life and memory, as if she were cancer. It did not work. Supposedly, it never does. I was also filled with remorse over the fact that I had lost so much emotional control when I found her in that hotel room, and that I could and would have murdered her if I had been carrying my revolver as I should have. I just couldn't trust my feelings if I spoke to her in prison. I'd probably do something silly, such as dismiss all of the theft and fraud accusations. However, the narcotic charges would remain, and she would be completely forgiven until the next time she went on a crazy narcotic binge. It was safer for me, I reasoned, to attempt to forget her completely. I did not attend her sentencing, but the ADA subsequently phoned to inform me that she took the proposed plea and got a sentence of 7 to 11 years in a state prison with the possibility of early release provided she finished the narcotic treatment program and at least a year of therapy thereafter. She offered to provide me contact information for the jail where Danielle had been placed, but I rejected, telling her I had no more interest in her well-being, which I did. I also did not show much concern for my personal well-being. My final 6 months of service in Ridgefield were practically unbearable. My lieutenant was enraged that I had gone up the chain over his head and attempted to make my life horrible in the 1,000 tiny ways that a second lieutenant boss could. I was eligible for automatic promotion from E3 senior airman to sergeant, still E3, therefore no salary increase. The Air Force conducts a lot of strange and ridiculous things like these that are almost hard to explain to civilians. However, my manager would repeatedly cancel my schedule to attend in training school, which was hosted locally on base, and was ostensibly immune to typical organizational unit influence, but not completely. My supervisor was monitoring me like a hawk, seeking for any small or petty write-up about me that he might use, and he seemed intent to harm my career. After receiving a letter of reprimand for the third time in 6 months, which I knew I didn't merit, I thought I had nothing to lose by returning to the first sergeant's office. I vented my frustrations to him for a bit, but I got the impression that, with just approximately 3 months remaining in my enlistment and no intentions to re-up, his choices were quite limited. He wasn't going to cause problems in the line of command for a three-striper who wasn't going to be there much longer. But I give him credit for recognizing that there was something else wrong with me that someone else could solve. I can't tell you to go speak to a chaplain, but it would be a particular favor if you did. Any of them, your choice. Then go back to me next week. We did not have a chaplain up on Eagle Hill. The closest one to us was a Lutheran pastor who had presumably pulled the short straw and had a modest office at the end of the flight line, which was only somewhat closer than the main base church. I liked him right away. He was a massive North Swede from Minnesota, with degrees in psychology and religion, and he had the laid-back Northern Lutheran act down to a science. I told him about my conversation with Danielle, and he appeared to pick up on all of the important aspects right away, even noting that when I told him about their finding at the hotel, my hand returned to my revolver holster. I told him, reluctantly and gradually, how I had meant to murder them and how only luck or providence had kept them alive. We ended up meeting for an hour every day for a week until I understood something profound about myself. Since my remorse for almost shooting my pistol at the lady I loved, I had difficulty simply putting on the holster, much alone discharging it. When I first completed my weapon qualification with the .28, I shot a 297 out of 300, comfortably qualifying for the small arms expert badge. I did much worse on my most recent trip to the range, only a 240 with multiple misses. The guilt was eating away at me, and worse things were certain to happen until I began to deal with it. It was evident, however, that I was no longer satisfied working in law enforcement and carrying a pistol that I was mentally incapable of deploying, even in self-defense. My alternatives were clear: cross-train into something different or leave the Army. Honestly, the cross-training concept seemed very decent. Can you type? My chaplain friend inquired. And I could quite well, really. He mentioned the possibility of becoming a chaplain assistant and joked that I could then write out all of his paperwork for him. We had a nice chuckle, and I acknowledged that there were definitely worse things. Under normal conditions, it is difficult to transition from law enforcement to another field. We, like the SP, have a low retention rate, and our conduct criteria are a little harsher than those in other AF skill groups. Also, there must be vacancies in your grade for the skill you want to learn in. This usually indicated a sucker job in comparison to your current one, such as sitting in a missile silo in the middle of nowhere. I was fortunate, however, and, with the assistance of my first sergeant, was able to be released from law enforcement and accepted into the chaplain assistant training program at Maxwell AFB, where I re-enlisted for another 4 years. I enjoyed the new work because it had a lot of crossover with conventional law enforcement. Crisis and suicide intervention, emergency stress management, domestic conflict situations, aircraft disasters, and routine fatalities were all part of the job, and I was very good at it. The work was far more than just being a glorified church secretary, and I probably spent a dozen hours assisting with issues over the phone or in person for every hour I spent putting out reports or doing anything even relevant to a sermon. Furthermore, by the time I was promoted to staff sergeant and then tech sergeant, I had secretaries who worked for me to handle such tasks. Not being really religious wasn't much of a disadvantage. In fact, nothing in my work description required me to attend any services ever. But I needed to know what was going on at all of them, so I could better organize their after-church activities. As my new job developed at most locations, I quickly rose to the position of senior NCOC, overseeing a team that supported a diverse range of chaplains, including Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. Some days, the Baptist preacher would be on call at 3 a.m. when an aircraft crashed or Airman Smith returned home intoxicated and enraged enough to begin hitting his or her spouse. Alternatively, the Methodist or Catholic priest, or even the rabbi, may be summoned to the house, and then I'd be the next one called. It didn't really matter. They all received the same call to service and performed as well. I never had a single issue with any of them. The crisis work was vital and rewarding to me, but as I neared the end of my 20-year military service, I began to enjoy the more routine elements, particularly managing youth groups and different outreach projects. I didn't drink much anymore. I still enjoy the occasional glass of red wine, but it suddenly became more important to me to help co-host the base AA meetings with the social action folks. And I even worked a little on the side with off-base Nikonon programs that always seemed to have a few below-the-radar military members attending. I spent my last tour of service back in Ridgefield, this time at Roosevelt AFB, where the Air Force conducts basic training, has many technical schools, and its main hospital, Barclays Center. I was the senior enlisted person in charge of a staff of hundreds who dealt with tens of thousands of individuals each day. I assigned younger NCOs to handle the 3 a.m. Phone calls are rare these days, but I made an effort to stay on top of things and deal with my fair share of personal disasters. I had been promoted to Senior Master Sergeant and had the opportunity to become Chief Master Sergeant, but I had decided that I had completed my 20 years and it was time to go on and do something else with my life. Plus, after you reach Chief, E9, the highest enlisted level, everything becomes military politics. Sooner or later, my growing buttocks would be sitting someplace in the Pentagon advising senior commanders on what policies we should implement in the future, which didn't seem even appealing to me. ID never married. To be honest, I hadn't been too tempted. The folks I saw on a daily basis were all dealing with some kind of problem, which is not conducive to finding a partner. The ladies I met off base were mainly from different Christian groups or organizations with whom I collaborated on various tasks. These were either zealous religious women or professional organizers who wanted to rule everyone else's life and with whom I never got along well. I like my work, but I didn't attend church 2 to 3 times a week. Once a month, I'd rotate across one of the several available services to get to know the faces and names a little better. The great majority of military women my age were previously married or divorced with children from many dads, and I just did not have the desire to cope with that kind of life drama on a long-term scale. Never married women tended to be either serious or uninterested. I didn't have the time or the desire to return to the local C&W pubs. Almost every military divorce I helped advise appeared to begin with, well, I met her at a bar. I wanted to find a lady and begin a permanent relationship, but I did not want another Danielle. I wasn't exactly living like a monk, but I wasn't having anything approximating normal sex either. With less than a month till my retirement, I was unmarried and had no preparations for life after retirement. I'd be okay on my retirement money, so I decided to remain in the region for a bit and look around for a large church that required a community affairs or youth group manager. I didn't set my expectations too high. The majority of the churches in the area seemed to be Southern Baptist or Catholic, and I was unlikely to be considered a sincere believer for employment and acceptance. The other churches seemed to be of a fairly same conservative bent, which would certainly need more quality time on my knees praying than I was accustomed to, particularly in retirement. A Benton County Social Services office expressed an interest in my background, but since their civil service promoted based only on seniority rather than merit, I would start at the bottom of their career ladder. I'd be spending my days dealing with crack infants and moms. I didn't believe I could maintain that level of passion for very long, so I declined. Another position at the local United Way office was not much better, long hours, little pay, and inane office politics. But until I received a bizarre letter from a church in neighboring Colby, Kansas, it seemed to be my best chance. The church had given me some basic information, and they had a rudimentary website where I might learn more. For openers, this church, known locally as the Church, was erected just on the boundary of a vast nudist colony. Technically, half of the church aisles were clothes optional, while the other half were more prudish, but that didn't matter to 98% of the county's population. It was the county's biggest church, and it handled a huge number of county civic initiatives almost by default. I was about to dismiss them as kooks, but the more I read, the more intrigued I became by the scope of their responsibilities. They oversaw the county's food bank for the needy, constructed houses for low-income families, restored elders' homes, offered free breakfast to children during the school year, and meals to low-income children during the summer. They supplied almost all of the county's crisis management services, held monthly employment fairs, and had weekly AA, NAR-Anon, and anger management meetings. The fact that they offered the normal religious youth and scouting organizations goes without saying. I was interested and wanted to meet the head pastor, Nicholas, just Nick in town, who had the courage and drive to pull it all together. Colby was a weird town, so having an eccentric church pastor did not seem out of place. Father Nick was a happy guy with a plump tummy and a heart that seemed to be 3 sizes larger. His age seemed to be undetermined. He had initially arrived to Colby in the late 1970s, but apart from his dark eyes, he didn't look to be any older than I was. They peered deep into your soul, and if you stared long and hard enough, you may glimpse eternity. The only eyes I've ever seen that came close to his were those of an elderly retired World War II soldier who was one of the first to liberate a death camp and had seen atrocities that would never be forgotten. He was seeking for a top director of church services who would oversee all the church did outside of Sunday morning sessions. It was a massive task that could keep 5 people working constantly from sunrise to nighttime if the phone did not ring at 3 a.m. If I were given the post, I would have a staff of 2. Tiny, a part-time motorcycle mechanic who handled the most of the children's activities, and a lifelong church secretary. The salary provided for the post was beyond low, bordering on horrible. I confessed directly at the beginning of our conversation, money going to pay me couldn't be used to repair a widow's house next week or to provide the 8 Wallace children with lunch and something to take to their sick mother for dinner. To be honest, the perfect candidate would not have compensation in their top 10 desired characteristics for the role. Job satisfaction had always been at least one of my top 5 priorities, and I could honestly agree with his assessment. They didn't want someone who saw this as a job, but rather someone who would gladly perform the task if asked, even for free, since it was vital and needed to be completed. Frankly, the job description changed on a weekly basis as they discovered new tasks that the weak county administration lacked the funds to do. It was evident that my first perception of church plus nudist colony plus youth groups equals big bunch of pervs was entirely incorrect. In fact, I don't believe ID want to be in the same vicinity as the poor sap around here who is found even trying to molest a kid. I don't believe they ever turned over the mangled remains to be charged. As we chatted, he questioned me further about my military career and past professional and personal connections with others. The questions became tougher, and it became more difficult to keep any tinge of truth from him. Not that I had contemplated any falsehoods, of course. It was just unusual that it was just impossible to avoid or hide anything other than the most totally entire and full truth in my responses. Among the many difficult things he asked me, what did I enjoy and hate about my chaplaincy jobs, was one of the simplest to respond. I stated I loathed politics and having to deal with individuals who had much bigger issues than I had. I freely admitted all of my own perceived shortcomings in painful detail, including admitting that I began my career in police enforcement and quit after almost committing a catastrophic mistake that plagued me for many years. He smiled gently at me and asked the $50,000 question that I had mainly ignored for the previous 15 years or so. Tell me about the biggest suffering that somebody has ever caused you, and have you ever forgiven them for it? Oh, my God. I began to recount the narrative of my difficulty with my former OIC at Eagle Hill, the scumsucker lieutenant, now a full colonel, I hear. But before I realized it, I was explaining the true story of my love for Danielle, her drug addiction, and how she betrayed me. An hour later, after I concluded the narrative, I was sobbing in his office like a scolded schoolgirl. He had magically torn away every layer of protective scabbing I had built up over the years to guard my heart, which had also kept me from ever wanting to love again. Now it was all gone, and the anguish seemed like it had just occurred yesterday. Of course, the answer was negative. I had not forgiven her, and most likely still haven't. I acknowledged because I had never completely lost my affection for her. This response seemed to appease him, so he added, "But today, if she walked into this room now, could you forgive her in your heart and begin to go on from there?" "I don't know," I said. And I honestly didn't know. I spoke all I wanted to and should have said. But when presented with a clear yes or no, I just couldn't make a choice. Then, the anguish of the event was as intense as it had ever been, and I was stuck once again in the raw intensity of it. Fine, that's a decent honest response, and ITLL enough for now. Let's speak about working with your staff members, he remarked, and we discovered a large number of possible concerns. Could I work well with Tiny, an ex-biker covered in tattoos who seemed enormous and intimidating enough to shatter me with his tiny finger, but was really as kind as a lamb? Not an issue. What about dealing with drug and alcohol addicts who wish to change? There is absolutely no difficulty. I provided him further information about my AA and Al-Anon work. Then we came to the last obstacle. So, if I were to tell you that our wonderfully outstanding church secretary, who has been with me for nearly 10 years and is utterly indispensable now, was once a serious narcotic abuser who willingly traded sex for narcotics and became a convicted felon. She had stolen money from everyone around her, her family, her friends, and her lovers to buy narcotics. She was also blackmailed by her narcotic dealers to do other awful things that she deeply regretted afterward when she mended herself. Brilliantly in jail, and is now a shining example to others. I entrust her with both my life and my finances. Could you do the same? Could you forgive her filthy history, which is now in the past, and evaluate her only on her actions from now on? I paused for a bit and said, yes, I believe so. I've learned a lot over the years about the ridiculous things addicts do to harm themselves and others, and I have nothing but admiration for those who have pulled themselves out of that abyss and made something of their lives since. Good. Allow me to present you to her secretary. Assume you were given the post and accepted. Of course, you can imagine that the church secretary was Danielle, or more accurately, that she now goes by her full name, Danielle Vallon. We took a few moments to avoid each other's gaze and admire the well-worn Persian rug on the floor of Father Nick's office. We eventually talked, welcomed each other by name, and began to shake hands, but ended up holding one another through tears. That pretty much concluded the interview. With a smirk, Nick said that Danielle and I seemed to be old friends who needed to catch up. We spent the next 4 hours in a great old-fashioned cafe just down the road from the church, with views of the fields. She had been clean when we met, but the people she was living with were still using and were a continuous temptation for her. She buckled under stress and began to use a little to attempt to take the edge off, which, of course, never works, and was quickly back to her old use and habits. She needed money for drugs and was promptly dismissed from her restaurant job on suspicion of stealing. She had done it, but they were unable to prove it. Logan, my former roommate, found her vulnerability and was astounded by how naive I had become because of my love for her. He initially blackmailed her for sex to keep her narcotic usage hidden from me, and then shortly after, had her doing tricks for a local pimp for narcotic money, with Logan receiving a portion of her cut to preserve her secrets. He was now using and selling for himself, and his judgment was deteriorating, as shown by his accepting to the theft of my credit card and wallet cash and accompanying her on that shopping spree. She wasn't even sure why she did it. ID never denied her anything. She was just out of her mind on drugs, doing bad things with terrible people in a never-ending downward slide into the gutter. The internal tension of hiding her undesirable conduct from the guy she loved and wanted to protect almost caused her to have a mental breakdown. She had loved me enough not to want to marry me because she was certain that, as a full-fledged opiate addict again, she would ultimately do something horrific to damage me. But she never imagined I'd discover her with one of her pimps at that hotel. That was way worse. Nonetheless, she understood years later that she should have come to me for assistance with the reality, but she loved me dearly and was terrified of losing the one true person who actually cared for her. She was correct. Faced with this terrible reality in a Ridgefield prison, I would surely not have forgiven her, would not have accepted her back into my heart or my life at the time, and would most likely have uttered many things in rage that I would later regret. Faced with this direct and ultimate rejection, she would most likely have had little interest in rehabilitation and, upon release from prison, resumed a life of narcotic addiction, likely becoming a total crack and meth head living under a bridge, recycling cans, and giving $5 BJs. Instead, she actively pursued therapy, leaving jail on parole after just a few years to begin a new career in social services, assisting other addicts. She stumbled into the church a few years later while on a vacation and has since made it the focal point of her new life. She wasn't a big fan of nudism, and our work didn't necessitate it, but it did assist on occasion. I couldn't help but think she looked great, and I wouldn't mind seeing her naked on the beach. We left friends, and for the first time in 16 years, my injured heart received a proper bandage, allowing it to begin to mend. The following Tuesday morning, when I returned to work in Ridgefield, I found an official written employment offer in my mailbox. Will I accept it? I want to. I'm 99% certain that this is where I'm intended to be right now in my life. However, it is not certain, and I will need to think about it for a few days. Nick says there's no urgency if I need time to make a decision, which I do. Have I forgiven Danielle Vallon? Yes, I believe I have entirely. Could I work with her every day? That's the part I'm not sure about. I now realize that I still love her, and she still loves me. We appear to have been waiting for each other for years, unmarried and never married to anyone else. Perhaps it was always meant to be this way, but I need to be fully certain of myself. If I step through that door, We'll embrace again like long-lost yet loving friends. We'd start having lunch and supper together. We'd start holding hands, and eventually we'd kiss. Then there would be breakfasts together and a wedding. Neither of us is capable of completing tasks halfway. I need to be absolutely certain that when I wake up in the morning, I will only see the lady I believe I can love for the rest of my life, and not some horrific recollection from the past. Can I make that firm commitment yet? Not today, definitely not tomorrow, and most likely not during my remaining 3 weeks in uniform. But after my retirement ceremony is complete and I take off my uniform for the last time, I believe the remaining 1% indecisive part of me will make the ultimate decision for me, and I'm certain I'll be able to live with it for the rest of my life. Thank you for viewing this amazing tale of loss, redemption, and the power of forgiveness. Could you forgive someone after such a severe betrayal, or is the past too hard to overcome? Please share your opinions in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales.